Hi, everybody. So we have Juma Iraki with us today. He is the founder of Iraki Nutrition. And so we got to talking. I've seen a lot of his work more recently, and I was impressed with it, so I wanted to bring him on. And for today's charity, I'm going to be making a donation to the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation because you're familiar with Crohn's yourself, having gone through that in 2013, correct? Having a procedure.
Correct. First off, thank you so much for bringing me on. It's a pleasure to be here. And like you said, I'm myself is a Crohn's disease sufferer, so really appreciate the donation you're making to the foundation.
Great, yeah. And I've looked into it in the past, and it is a good cause, so I'm happy to do that. So we'll bring you on because you have great knowledge in nutrition and in exercise science as well. And looking at your Instagram recently, there was some controversial posts there, more controversial posts, not to anybody who's very evidence-based, but we see controversy around it. And one of them is the testosterone studies that were done. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And can you just briefly mention what they show us?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a researcher called Bazine that did a couple of studies like almost 20 years ago, I think. I think the first study he came out with was the classical study from '96, where they were basically trying to see what effect supraphysiological doses of testosterone had on strength and muscle development. So they had some guys there that was taking either a placebo or 600 milligrams of testosterone. And just to put it in perspective, usually a male produces naturally around, usually they say between 50 and 70 milligrams of testosterone a week. So we're talking about approximately 10 times the amount which is natural to produce for a male. So what they did in this study was they had one group that didn't exercise and got placebo. Then you had another group that didn't exercise and got 600 milligrams of testosterone. Then you had the third group that got a placebo and exercised, and then the fourth group exercised and got 600 milligrams of testosterone. So probably not a big surprise that the group that took testosterone and exercise, they had like massive gains in fat-free mass during the 10 weeks this study was on. But the thing is that in this study, what was shockingly to many people maybe was that the group that didn't exercise and got 600 milligrams of testosterone each week actually had bigger gains in fat-free mass than the group that was exercising and getting the placebo. And like the thing is with testosterone is that when you reach a certain level, you actually see some good benefits even when you don't exercise. I'm not saying that you will see continue seeing these gains, but it clearly shows the advantage that you get from taking these drugs. Advantage is probably a bad word, but you know what I'm saying. Because it's in the fitness industry, a lot of people will often say, well, steroids doesn't work unless you actually exercise. Well, they clearly work without doing any exercise. So just imagine what they actually can do to you if you combine that with exercise. And Bazine also had a follow-up study because there's also a myth in the fitness industry where people say, well, there's a ceiling for how much testosterone that you can benefit from, and after that, it doesn't do anything. But Bazine actually had a study where he gave the subject something called a GnRH antagonist, which basically deletes your endogenous testosterone production. And then he gave various doses of testosterone to subjects. So I think it was 25, 50, 125, 300, and 600 milligrams of testosterone each week. And this study was for, I think it was 5 months, like 20-week period. And you clearly see in that study that the more testosterone you take, it's very linear that the more gains you actually make. I think there was one subject in that study that gained almost 11 kilograms of fat-free mass during that 20-week period. And bear in mind, these subjects didn't train in the study. So this is just from the testosterone they were taking. On the other end, you would see people that were in the low testosterone group, because when you're getting like 25 milligrams of testosterone and you're not producing anything endogenously, it's clearly too low. So you see decreases in muscle mass and huge increases in fat mass. I think there was one subject who gained like 12 kilograms of fat during the 20-week period. So he clearly was in the low testosterone group. But yeah, these are like powerful drugs. And my opinion is that when you look at the effect they have, they also seem to have effects on the cellular level that doesn't go away when you actually stop. So you actually have benefits from just taking it once that would last a lifetime. So my opinion has always been that if you ever get caught by doing drugs in organized sport, you should basically be banned for life from sport, because you get these advantages that doesn't really go away. And I know many scientists share the same opinions as I have on this topic, but yeah, it's crazy to me when people say, well, they don't do anything unless you actually exercise and nutrition. And it's true to a point, but you're still getting a lot of benefits from having such high doses of testosterone in your system.
Yeah, and I think it just doesn't. A lot of people just don't want to accept that. A lot of people who take something don't want to accept that, because I mean, I had a coach, years ago, and this was at the point where coaching wasn't like it is today, where it's very accessible. So he was clearly using a lot of substances at the time, and I was, 19 at the time, so I was pretty new to everything as far as that realm goes, and I remember showing him that study, or at least a related study, and telling him about it. And he was just like, no, that's not true. You won't gain more if you take anything. But again, I think they kind of just don't want to accept that that's the truth. And no, like you said, nobody is saying you're going to become Mr. Olympia. Of course, these people train harder, and it does give you the capacity to train harder because you're recovering more. But it's very clearly shown that you can literally sit on your ass and gain muscle. And that's why these were created in the first place. This wasn't, steroids weren't created to help bodybuilders. They were created for people with muscle wasting diseases. So AIDS patients who are getting, tons of benefits from them, they're not going up and working out. They're oftentimes lying in a bed and still putting on 10, 15 pounds of muscle, because these are medications essentially when they were first created for them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the benefits that maybe people don't think about, like if you think like what does actually make muscles grow, like you have all the signaling that goes on, but when you actually start to build muscle, you have protein synthesis on one side, and then you have protein breakdown on the other. And usually what I tell my clients and students here in Norway is that protein balance is like if you have a brick wall and you have one guy on one side putting on bricks, and then you have another guy on the other side taking off bricks. So the guy taking off is breakdown, and the guy putting bricks on is protein synthesis. If they work equally, you're not going to get a bigger wall. But if protein synthesis is more than breakdown, you're going to get a bigger wall. And if breakdown is more than synthesis, you're going to get a decrease in the wall. When you take steroids, it's basically like the guy that puts bricks on the wall beat the shit out of the guy that is taking the brick wall. So he's able to just complete his job, and the walls just keep on getting bigger and bigger. So you have an increase in protein synthesis, and you also have a decrease in protein breakdown. So you're getting two benefits. So it's much easier to be in a positive protein balance, which again leads to greater gains in muscle mass. So that's one of the things that people seem to forget, because contrary to what people actually think, when you do take steroids, you actually need less protein. And I know a lot of bodybuilders think that if I take more steroids, I actually need more protein to build more mass, but you actually get more efficient. So it's easier to build more mass with actually less protein, because of the increases in synthesis and the decreases in breakdown.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it just kind of amplifies results in all regards there. So, and now your background obviously is very much in nutrition. And another thing I saw you bring up recently that seems to be still an ongoing debate is dairy. And a lot of people say that the research for dairy that shows it's positive is just because it's funded by the dairy industry and things along that line. So what do you have to say for the people who are still harping about how bad dairy is?
Well, I usually tell people, because this is a topic that usually creates a lot of debate, especially when I lecture. I usually have one or two vegans in the audience, and
Yeah.
we get into like heated debates. But the thing is that I never forced anyone to eat anything. I clearly say to people that like there's no magic foods. You can basically get your calcium from other sources, but to get calcium, it's much easier to get it from dairy due to the high concentrations of calcium you get from dairy. Not to
Right.
also mention that the quality of protein you get from dairy compared to other sources is like superior. So there's studies showing that you need double the amount of soy protein compared to whey protein to get the same effect on protein synthesis. So to me, it's just stupid to be honest, to exclude dairy from your diet if you're not allergic or
Right.
intolerant to it. And research is pretty clear on the benefits that you get from dairy. Like you see benefits on decreased risk for cardiovascular disease, decreased risk for type 2 diabetes, decreased risk for bone fractures. So there's a lot of benefits that you see from dairy, even like reduced risk for various cancers. The only cancer it's unclear if dairy can have a negative effect or not is actually on prostate cancer. So if you look at the literature, you'll see that on prostate cancer is a bit, it's not really clear if it's beneficial or not. But if you look at the total, you'll see that as a total, you will see that dairy has a lot of benefits, not only for those who exercise, but for general health as well. And to me, people seem to think that dairy has only been part of the human diet for a short period of time, but we actually have studies showing that dairy has been part of the human diet for several thousand of years. Like they have these old fossils where they analyze what they've actually been eating, and they actually find traces of whey protein, not the protein powder, but like whey is like dairy milk is 20% whey. So they find traces of whey protein. They even find evidence of humans making cheese several thousand years ago. So it's clearly been part of our diet for a very, very long time. And people often say, well, we are the only species that drink milk from another animal, which is bullshit, to be honest. There's evidence showing that feral cats steal milk from seal elephants, so there's that. But I usually tell people, well, why are we comparing ourselves to animals? Like, I don't get it why because usually we have different types of diets for different types of animals, but then again, we're completely different from animals in so many ways. We do completely different things compared to a lot of animals. So why why is dairy the only discussion that we have where we try to compare ourselves to other animals? It doesn't make sense. Like, you don't see animals in nature sitting on Skype on a Friday night discussing topics. It's like, it's plain stupid to me to talk about these things, because we clearly have several benefits from dairy. There's a lot of nutrients there that's easier to cover if you use dairy, for example, calcium. So if you can stomach dairy and you don't have any issues with it, I think it's just stupid to exclude it from your diet, because it's just going to make it harder for you to get all the micronutrients that you need in the diet.
Yeah, I always thought that was a strange argument where, I mean, either way you frame it, like the natural argument or the caveman argument or anything like that. I mean, personally, I don't care what our caveman ancestors did. I want to know what it's doing for us now and whether it's actually beneficial, regardless of what was done in the past. Because obviously, plenty of things that were done in the past were not optimal. So it's kind of irrelevant to me.
Yeah, and put it this way, if you provided a caveman a Big Mac, he would probably eat that as well. So it's just
Yeah.
a stupid argument to. And the thing is that people often say, well, they didn't get cardiovascular disease or they didn't get type 2 diabetes, but well, again, they lived to they were like 30 years old, so it doesn't.
Right.
Yeah, it's just it's just stupid to use that as an argument as well. So yeah.
Sure. And you know, another big controversial topic now is kind of the opposite of vegan is the keto diet. And so, I know you had a recent article where you said like our carbs is really the problem, and it seems to be it's still like really hammered on now that carbs are the devil. And I just got into it yesterday. Some girl was trying to tell me how, you know, carbs will turn off all fat burning, and that's why people can go on Atkins and eat as much as they want and still lose weight. And it just seems like there's a disconnect with people who just aren't looking at the evidence. So why do you think that is, and what do you see in the research?
Well, if you look at keto diets, which actually control for like where they actually match protein and calories, you don't really see any benefits from going keto. There's no more fat loss or superior advantages to fat loss with a keto diet. And this is a study that came out in 2016 from Kevin Hall, which was basically a metabolic ward study where they actually control for a lot of variables. So it's difficult to argument against that study, to be honest. And they clearly show that there's really no benefits. There's really no benefits to it. But I think when people talk about carbohydrate, they maybe think of it in a really simple way, because usually what people think is, well, I eat carbs, I secrete insulin, insulin stops fat oxidation, and that's why I'm getting fat. That's the way people think about it. But usually what I tell people is, if you think about it, what are your fat stores supposed to be? They're stored energy for when you don't have access to food, right? So does it really make sense that you're going to use those stores when you're actually adding in food in your system? No, it doesn't. So people seem to forget that the body is it's a very dynamic system. So you'll have periods during the day where you store energy and then you release energy, and then you store energy and then you release energy. And then at the end of the day, you basically calculate it. Was there more storage and then release? If it's the same, nothing's going to happen. If it was more storage than release, you'll gain weight. And if it's more release than storage, you'll lose weight. So I think people seem to misunderstand that. And there's data from the United States, showing that carbs have actually decreased the intakes for several years now, from the 1980s until I think it was 2010. The data from Dr. Stéphane Gouinet, where he showed this. But the trend has been the same actually here in Norway as well. We have a decrease in carbohydrate intake, decrease in sugar intake, but obesity is still going up. So what seems to be the cause? Well, we're moving less now, especially work-related activities. We're depending more on machines, so our energy expenditure is low, and in addition, we're actually eating more calories. So there's a mismatch between we've decreased our activity, we've increased our caloric intake. And some people ask, where are the excess calories coming from? It seems to be added fat, so butters, oils, and stuff like that, because you don't really pay attention to these things. Like, say you're cooking rice, for example, in a deep fryer, and then you put in in a frying pan, and then you put in oils. You're not really paying attention to that, and it's not really adding in any satiating effects, because it doesn't really take up a lot of room in your stomach. But doing this with oil can be like adding in 250, 300 calories, and people are like not thinking about these things. I'm not saying that oils and fats are bad. I'm just saying that people might need to be more wary about these things, because like you only need a tablespoon of oil and it's 100 calories, compared to like eating a banana, which is equal amount, or 100 grams of chicken breast, which is the same. I'm pretty sure we can all agree that oil is probably the thing that's going to leave you least satiating from those three options. So it's very energy dense, and it's easy to get in a lot of calories. So when it comes to carbohydrates and obesity, I think I'm not saying that keto diet and low carb diets can't be used, because some people adhere better to a diet when it's lower in carbs. So I've had clients that basically when they eat more carbs, they don't really feel well. They feel they're tired. It seems to increase their appetite. And then when we decrease their carbohydrate intake and use a higher protein diet and increase their fat, it seems to have a better effect for them. What I'm against is having like this universal diet where we recommend everyone doing keto or everyone doing a low carb diet. That's what I'm having issues with. But if you're inactive, like you're spending most of the day at a desk and not exercising, you're probably not going to need as much carbs, and you're probably not going to need as much total calories as well. And you do see that people who are overweight seems to tolerate carbohydrates worse than people that are lean um, due to decreased insulin sensitivity. What's funny, I just want to mention this since we're on the topic. Usually people talk about low carb and ketogenic diets being good diets for diabetes. So what you're trying to do when you have type 2 diabetes is you're trying to increase the insulin sensitivity so you're not dependent on drugs and stuff like that, right? The thing is that I recently did a study on cyclists where we fed them a high-fat diet, and then we measured their glucose the day after. And bear in mind, this is a huge study. Like, it was one high-fat meal, and we basically saw tendencies to insulin resistance just with that one high-fat meal the next day, because we had much higher glucose concentrations. And over time, like if you look at performance and athletes, for example, you do see that as soon as you get fat adapted by eating a low carb, high fat diet, you do have a reduced ability to actually use carbohydrate as fuel. And that's due to downregulations of an enzyme called PDH, which is important to actually oxidize carbohydrates. So Stellingworth had a paper, I think it was published in 2006, where they fat adapted people and then they actually carved them up. But what they actually saw that even if you carb up when you're fat adapted, you can't metabolize carbohydrates in the same way as if you were eating carbohydrates regularly. So it seems to be that you have to actually choose. Are you going to use primarily fat as fuel, or are you going to primarily use carbohydrates? And if you look at performance, carbohydrates, when it comes to high intensity performance, always beats the shit out of fats, to be honest. There are several studies showing benefits from carbohydrate feeding when you're exercising at high intensities. But it needs to be adjusted for the needs for the exercises you're doing and also the type of training that you're doing. So the old recommendations in Sport Nutrition was eat as much carbs as possible, but that's changed the last couple of years, and it's been more like a customized approach to how much carbohydrate you should eat based on how much are you training and how glycogen depleting is the training that you actually do. Because there's a big difference between carbohydrate dependency for strength athletes compared to endurance athletes. It doesn't really deplete the muscles in the same way when you're doing strength compared to endurance. And just to show you how big of a difference there is, when we did a study on cyclists, we had them doing interval section for 2 hours, session for 2 hours, and then we did biopsies and measured their glycogen, and they were pretty much depleted after we were done with the 2 hours cycling session. If you do weight training, like there's a study by Tesh from 1986, if you do 20 sets on legs and you take all the sets to failure, you're basically just depleting your glycogen by 40%.
Yeah.
So even if you took like 20 sets to failure, you basically just depleted 40% of your glycogen stores. And when you think about it, it's logic, because let's say you work out for an hour, how many minutes of that hour are you actually doing exercise? Because you're
Sure.
resting in between. But when you're doing endurance type sports, you're constantly pedaling on your bike for maybe several hours. You're not
Mhm.
really getting time to rest and recyclate some of the stuff that goes on in the body, and then you become more carbohydrate dependent because you're just depleting all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never been big into endurance sports, but I definitely have seen the data that you're talking about. And personally, so I've done keto a few times just to experiment with it, just to, if I'm going to recommend it to anybody, I want to have done it myself. And I don't notice a decrease in performance at all.
Hmm.
But like you said, most of what I do is weight training or intervals, but the intervals are, 10, 15-second sprints. And I mean, when it's like, 15 seconds, I don't think you're really depleting that much. And so far, I've not noticed any decrement in performance. But obviously, if you're doing, a longer term activity, one thing I will say is it seems like a lot of the studies are shorter term. And you will have some people like Dom D'Agostino and others will say how they think for full keto adaptation, it takes months. And I don't think most of the studies really go out that long. But other than that caveat, I would agree with everything you just said.
Yeah, I know that, and I'm glad you brought it up because I know some of the arguments are often that, well, it's too short of a duration on the study and they weren't really fat adapted. But you actually see that fat adaptations do occur after 5 days. I know I think it was a study by Volek that looked
Hmm.
at ultra endurance athletes, these guys that run several hundred kilometers, and they
Yeah.
really didn't see any difference. They really didn't see any difference in performance between a keto diet and a carbohydrate diet. But then again, when you're running for that long, you don't really have a high intensity when you're running. So
Hmm.
most likely you're using more fats at that intensity. But it's more like when you reach up in the higher percentages of your VO2 max that you really see that that's when you really start to see that you need carbohydrates. Um,
Yeah.
but but then again, it's totally like I've seen studies where you look at individual data, and there's people that do great on ketogenic diets,
Right.
but like if you look at the trend, because always when you present in studies, you present the average, you see that most people do worse with high fat diet, and they do much better with the carbohydrate diet. But like you said, it depends on the sport. Like I would never put a cyclist on a
Hmm.
ketogenic diet, but I think you can get away with it for strength sports and stuff like that. But I am. I have a presentation that I do on optimizing nutrition for muscle hypertrophy, where are like some of the arguments for high fat feeding when it comes to strength training is basically higher testosterone levels. So there's a
Hmm.
study by Volek from '97 where they show that there's a linear relationship between the amount of fat that you eat and the amount of serum testosterone that you have. But then again, do you think there's a difference between going from 600 to 800?
Right.
It's
When is that
really,
such a small difference?
yeah, it's as long as you're in the normal range. I don't think like these small fluctuations in testosterone are really going to give you any meaningful benefits to strength training. But if you go from being deficient to optimizing it, or if you go from having normal levels to supraphysiological levels, then you see a massive difference. But I
Sure.
don't think these small fluctuations that you see really are doing much. And I think a lot of people eat a lot of fat because they're worried about testosterone. And the thing is that one of the things that I mentioned with fat is that when you eat a high fat diet, you decrease the body's ability to also use carbohydrates when you get fat adapted.
Hmm.
And carbs have more benefits to muscle growth than fat does. Like it's very limited to what actually fat does. Like it's an energy source, and then it also helps you with optimizing hormone levels. But the requirement that you need to optimize that are much slower than what people might think. But when you look at carbohydrates for someone that's into physique sports, bigger glycogen stores will make you look bigger. It's easier to perform better in the gym. And there's actually also some stuff happening on the cellular level that seems to be important when you ingest carbohydrates compared to fat. Fat has actually been shown that if you eat fat in close proximity to your training session, and I'm talking about like high amounts of fat, it does seem to downregulate some of the signaling pathways that are important to muscle growth. So I usually don't recommend people eating high-fat meals before and after exercise. One, because of the digestion, but number two, because of it doesn't seem to be optimal for the remodeling of skeletal muscle.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the whole thing with studies reporting averages too, because I don't think anybody's saying that if you feel great on keto, don't eat keto. If you feel great on it, maybe it's for you. But when we're talking about these studies, we're looking at when we make recommendations to the general population, this is what we're finding on average. So I think that's a good point to bring up.
Yeah.
And as far as, within carbs, you have some people talking about gluten intolerances and gluten sensitivities. And so outside of celiac disease, where you obviously can't have gluten, do you think there's anything to the whole gluten sensitivity thing? Because I think most research shows no, but you have this, huge group of people who do seem to believe it. And whether or not it's actually the gluten, or maybe when they took out gluten, they're removing other ingredients, they seem to feel better for whatever reason. So why do you think that is?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the studies that came out that tried to show that there was actually people that could have non-celiac gluten intolerance. What they basically did was they exposed people for gluten, and then they didn't expose them for gluten, but the subject didn't know when they were exposed for gluten or not. But what they didn't account for was that there's been a ton of research showing that if you eat foods that are so-called low FODMAPs food, which is basically the diet you follow if you have irritable bowel disease, and it seems to be working really well for a lot of people. I saw a review that was published in 2015 that showed that 80% of IBS patients that follow a low FODMAP diet actually see improvements in their symptoms.
Yep.
And FODMAPs is basically carbohydrates that some people can't digest optimally, so they get issues like gas, crampings, diarrhea, etc., etc. Well, what they didn't account for in that first study, where they concluded with, well, some people can have non-celiac gluten intolerance, they didn't control for the FODMAPs. So they did a follow-up study where they actually controlled for the FODMAPs. So they removed all the high FODMAPs food. They were eating a low FODMAP food, and then they actually exposed them for gluten. And the subject didn't report any ill symptoms. So it does seem to be the case of maybe it's more the FODMAPs and not necessarily the gluten that's causing the problem for a lot of people. Because usually when it comes to, let's say, breads, usually patients that have IBS, they struggle with wheat and rye, but like spelt doesn't really cause any issues for them, and that contains gluten, but it doesn't really cause issues for them. And actually, it's been more and more coaches and athletes incorporating low FODMAP diet before competitions, just to slow down the risk of having GI issues. So I personally do it myself with a lot of athletes, because usually when you are close to competition, you start to get nervous, and some people actually, I have a couple of athletes that develop lactose intolerance the last week before competitions, but usually they're fine with drinking milk, and it's probably have something to do with them being nervous or something like that, and it's causing some imbalance with their enzymes. But usually what we'll do is low FODMAP diet, we'll switch to lactose-free products the last week. will scale back on the fiber, and that usually helps a lot with their digestion. But I'm not saying that there aren't any people that might have non-celiac gluten intolerance, but I think it's way lower than what you get the impression of, because nowadays everybody's allergic to gluten, and yeah, so I think it's more. I've had several people say to me, well, I'm allergic to milk and I don't tolerate gluten, and then after doing some trials and errors, it's basically the FODMAP. So we start to include lactose-free products, and we just eliminate the carbohydrate that's causing the problems, and they're completely fine with both the gluten and the dairy in their diet.
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you if you have special modifications for the people you train or work with who have inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome. It sounds like you kind of answered that, though, as far as FODMAP, lowering FODMAP foods.
Yeah, I have good experience with FODMAP. I used to work before I went into sports nutrition, I actually used to work at a medical clinic. So for 2 years, I actually worked with diabetes, cardiovascular disease, but I worked a lot with patients that had GI issues. And I remember looking at research back in 2012 showing early signs of FODMAP being an effective treatment for these things. So I remember some of the doctors that I used to work with, they were like, it's bullshit, and for IBS it's all in their head, and it's nothing related to what they're eating, because if you go back, you would see doctors treating IBS patients with antidepressants because they were saying, well, they clearly show symptoms of depression. And I was always like, well, aren't you maybe thinking that they're depressed because of having IBS and chronically having problems with their GI? Because imagine going around having chronic issues with your bowel system. It can be frustrating, and you can develop suppressed mood from these things.
Sure.
So, but I know also that there's these serotonin receptors in your stomach that can get affected from antidepressant, and they can potentially have a positive effect. But then again, it seems to work much better with the low-fat FODMAP treatment that we have now for IBS patients.
Yeah, the pathology and how it works is pretty interesting. And obviously there's some significant differences between IBS and IBD. But like you said, there are higher rates of depression among those patients. So it does get frustrating, I think, with the medical community when they fail to recognize the benefits of diet there. And I'm definitely not somebody who says, we don't need medication, we just need food. But there are certainly studies showing the benefits of low FODMAP diet and other diets for people with GI distress.
Yeah, absolutely, and I completely agree that often you might need a combination of medication and making adjustments to your diet. But it's interesting for me because I actually was really interested in IBS. So I did my bachelor's degree was actually on the effect of probiotics on IBS, because during that time there wasn't really any options, but nowadays it seems to be recognized as a good treatment to use the low FODMAP diets for IBS patients.
Do you see any benefit in supplements like digestive enzymes or betaine HCl to help there?
To be honest, I've never really seen personally any benefits on myself and the patients that I've worked with. Probiotics is always a hit and miss, to be honest. Some people seem to get benefits from it. Other people seem to get worse from it. And I think Kamal Patel did something on examine.com regarding this, and it's so complex because you might have a probiotic product which has like the complete opposite of the bacteria that you actually need
Right.
for your digestive system.
Right.
So that's probably the cause why it's having such variations and the effect that's it's giving. But to be honest, no. I've seen some research showing glutamine might have an effect for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. But other than that, I haven't really seen, in my experience, with the patients that I previously worked with, any benefits from both the other things.
Yeah, that's my experience too. Unfortunately, I never really saw any benefit from digestive enzymes, betaine HCl, or probiotics, and I've tried them several times just because there's a ton of anecdote out there and some research, but in my experience, it didn't really do anything.
Yeah, it's cool
So
because you actually take if you take the digestive enzymes and you like cook your oatmeal completely dry and you open up a capsule of digestive enzyme and just sprinkle it over it actually starts to digest in the bowl.
really,
Yeah.
I've
It's a
never tried
pretty
that
cool
before.
experience. Yeah, you should try that. It's a cool experience.
Oh, that's funny. So a lot of this, we're talking about having to limit certain foods for various reasons, but obviously nowadays flexible dieting is a generally prescribed approach. What do you see as the flaws, though, with some people? I think it's how people handle the ability to flexible diet psychologically, where they take it too far. And, I think when most of us say flexible dieting, we mean eat a generally healthy diet, but you can fit some other things in. But do you find that some people really abuse that and don't seem to handle it well and kind of go off the rails because they think they have that freedom?
Absolutely. Like to me, the idea of flexible dieting is good, but I think it's misunderstood by a lot of people. Like it's almost like you have two camps. You have the clean eating camp where nothing is allowed Monday to Saturday, and then on Sunday you can binge as much as you want on everything.
Right.
And then you have the so-called, if it fits your macros, flexible dieters that feel that think that it's a competition of how much energy dense food you can fit in your diet and still hit your macros.
Right.
To me, flexible dieting is more understanding that, well, if you're out of bananas, you can eat an apple or an apple or two and substitute the amount there. Or if you want to go out with friends on Saturday, you might want to maybe scale back on your caloric intake 1 to 2 days in advance and save up some calories, and then you can enjoy a night out with your friends. That's more the philosophy of flexible dieting for me, knowing the adjustments you can make while still enjoying and having a social life. So what I typically do with a lot of my clients is basically I give them a bigger, like I tell them, I give them a bigger budget on Saturday and Sunday, because most people have a tendency to do really well Monday to Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday they have cravings and they end up eating way more than they're supposed to. So what I typically do is I'll take like 200 calories extra Monday to Friday, and the amount that I save up, I either divide it on Saturday and Sunday for them, or I'll say, well, you can have one day if you want, and then you can just eat the amount. It doesn't really matter when you do these things. It's just for adherence, I just see that most clients do better on having that approach where they have a bigger budget Saturday to Sunday. But I try as much as possible helping people understanding how to get results, but also having how would I say it? Like a
Healthy
more
mindset about it.
a more a laid back approach to nutrition. Like it's for me, people when let's say you're at the office and you eat a slice of cake and it's not on your meal plan, people have a tendency to be on and off their diets. So they're on the diet, they ate the cake, which was maybe 400 calories, and they're like, oh shit, everything is screwed. Now I'm just going to binge for the rest of the weekend, and then I'll start over on Monday. So you
Right.
basically took a problem that wasn't really a problem and made it into a problem. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost like driving your car in your garage and getting a small scratch, and they're like, okay, that's it. I got a scratch on my car. I might as well just ruin the car completely because I need to take care of it later on. Or I've recently read on Instagram. I don't remember who said that, but the same. It's like having a flat tire and then saying, well, I have a flat tire now. Might as well just stick a knife in the three others and be
Gotta
done
get a
with
new
it.
tire anyway, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, to me, it's trying to help a lot of people getting away from that black and white mentality, because I think that's the biggest problem for a lot of people. Like, most people know that to lose weight you need to be in a caloric deficit, but it's more about it's a lot of people focus a lot on the exercise and they focus a lot on the nutrition, but they forget the environmental factors that you also need to take into consideration, like, are you sleeping optimally, how are your stress levels, stuff like that that people might not think a lot about. But if you're chronically undersleeping and you're chronically stressed, you're going to secrete a lot more ghrelin, which basically are going to make you more hungry. And that's probably the number one reason why people that lose weight regain weight again. They don't have a complete lifestyle that take into considerations all these things. Because most people can lose the weight, very few people can lose the weight and keep it off.
Right. Yeah. It seems to be the much bigger problem in America. Well, I say America, but really all over now. So.
Yeah.
So my last question is, I like to end on kind of an actionable step for people. So you work with bodybuilders and powerlifters and different athletes. What is your advice for people who, they kind of have an idea of what sport they want to go into, but they want to look further into how to optimize their nutrition for their specific sport? Because there's a lot of general recommendations, but we don't see as many sport specific recommendations. So how would you recommend people go about finding the best info for that?
Well, I think it's much easier nowadays than it was when I started lifting when I was 16. You basically had the forums and you had
Mm-hmm.
Flex magazine, which was complete bullshit when you look at it now.
Yeah.
But I think social media is probably the best source to actually find useful information. I actually have an article on my website where a lot of the recommendations I have for information to people is locating the most evidence-based, influential people in the industry and follow them, because usually they share a lot of good content. It's easy to stay on top of things by doing that way. But I always tell people that try to be critical about where you get your information from. There's a ton of information out there that's completely wrong,
Yeah.
but then again, now we actually have a lot of good resources out there that can help you get more useful information. And one of the best tips I have, to be honest, for people that are specifically into bodybuilding training or just want to lose some weight and build some muscle, is invest in Eric Helm's nutrition pyramid books. Like, that's probably going to be the best $60 or $70 you ever invest in anything, because it's basically sums up all the research that you need to know about in a very smart and easy to understand way. So it's in a prioritized manner where Eric go through every step of what's important in regards to training and nutrition, and it's explained in a way that most people will be able to understand.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Great points. And yeah, I think social media nowadays is, you find people like you, 3DMJ, a lot of these guys are putting out great information all the time. So I think that's a great recommendation. And so where can people find you? I mean, you're on social media as well. So IrakiNutrition.com, right? And where else?
Yeah, basically IrakiNutrition.com. You can find my podcast on, which is basically Iraki Nutrition Podcast. You can find that on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube. and I'm not that active on social media. I'm trying to be more active now on social media, so you can check out our Instagram account where we frequently share infographics. It's Iraki_nutrition. And what we're trying to do there is basically have infographics where we summarize the research and present it in a way that everybody can understand, basically. So
Awesome.
Instagram is probably the channel where we share and have most of our content.
Great. Awesome, man. Well, thanks for talking with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on. It was great to be here and speaking with you.
Thank you all for tuning in to the interview with Juma Iraki today. If you want to see more interviews like that, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment down below regarding either topics or people that you'd like to see covered. And if you like the charity that we're donating to today, please feel free to make your own donation as well.